Long before the modern label serial killer came into the common vernacular, Victorian Britain witnessed notorious multiple murderers. In the press and public imagination, these criminals were often dubbed with colourful names: Black Widows, poisonous monsters, even baby farmers, rather than a clinical umbrella term. But the concept of a compulsive serial murder was foreign to Victorian police and courts too, who tended to treat each murder case in isolation. Nevertheless, we can certainly identify many Victorian cases that clearly fit the pattern of serial murder. Individuals who killed multiple victims in separate incidents for motives ranging from greed to sadistic compulsion. The name that immediately jumps to mind is probably Jack the Ripper, and I've done a video on him already. We will exclude him from our talk today, and it's not out of lack of interest, but it's more to shine a light on the other Victorian serial killers, both famous and obscure, who have haunted London and beyond. And so, in our time together today, we're going to look at the more unique and lesser-known instances of murder, and also the era's investigative methods, the forensic science, the contemporary attitudes, and even the social context. Really, the goal is to understand these crimes not just as morbid tales, and not to dress anything up in this romanticism, but to look at them as a window into Victorian society, with all of its prejudices, its fears, and its technological limitation. And also, a little bit towards the end, we'll take a look at some of the evolving legal and scientific responses to this new kind of evil. But first, let me welcome you to the channel. It's a pleasure to have you with me. If you are new, I would like to invite you to click that subscribe button and remind you that there are plenty of other videos like this in the playlists, anything that catches your fancy. Now, the other thing is too, this video is completely ad-free for your enjoyment, uninterrupted, along with all the other videos on this channel in the library. This is due to the contributions on the Patreon, YouTube memberships, the occasional donation through either PayPal or the Super Thanks on YouTube, and of course the merch store, where you'll find plenty of interesting little goodies. Now, with all that being said, you can find all those appropriate links in the pinned comment and the video description. Now, let's get on to the topic of today. And we're not going to waste any time. We're going to get right into it with Dr. William Palmer. Now, this first case takes us to the 1850s, and that is earlier in Victoria's reign, and introduces one of the era's most infamous figures, dubbed the Rugeley poisoner, or even the Prince of Poisoners, Dr. William Palmer. This story shows the Victorian poison panic, and certainly marks a milestone in terms of forensic science. Palmer was a country doctor from Staffordshire, with a polished manner and a vicious gambling habit. Between 1846 and 55, a suspicious number of people around him died suddenly. It was only when one victim, a friend who had won a horse race and a large sum of money, died in agony after a celebratory dinner with Palmer, that authorities finally raised an eyebrow and intervened. Palmer was put on trial in 1856 for poisoning his friend, John Parsons Cook. The secret ingredient? Strychnine. During the trial, evidence and testimony hinted that Cook was likely not Palmer's only victim. In fact, it was strongly suggested that the more they looked into things, that Palmer had also poisoned his brother, his wife, and even possibly, and this is the worst part, 4 of his young children. What was the motive? Chiefly It was money. It usually comes down to that, collecting on life insurance or erasure of debts. Well, this possibility that a trusted physician and a family man could secretly murder for multiple sources of profit from relatives was a source of horror and fascination to the Victorian public. Certainly made an interesting write-up in the papers, no doubt. Palmer's trial became a media sensation and a test of emerging forensic science. The Times devoted over 50 articles to the case. An illustrated special of the Times was published, complete with drawings of the courtroom drama, and even the sights in Rugeley associated with the murders. Crowds packed the courtroom and milled outside for news. Part of the draw was the novel scientific evidence presented. Chemists performed meticulous analyses to detect strychnine or other poisons in the victim's organs. There was also detailed discussion of the symptoms Cook exhibited. Terrible convulsions before death, a strong suggestion of strychnine poisoning. Palmer's defense tried to sow doubt, implying that the tests were inconclusive, or that Cook might have just died of natural causes or drank himself to death. But the forensic experts at the time, including a rather trailblazing toxicologist Alfred Swain Taylor, were persuasive in explaining how the poison worked, and why the absence of strychnine residue did not mean that it hadn't been used. Now, strychnine can be hard to find after death, by the way, and this mainly because it's metabolized at a very rapid rate. One of the reasons why people were using it. Well, this was cutting-edge science for the time, and the public were loving every bit of it. The technical medical details of poisoning were followed with rapt interest. Like we said, 50 articles in the Times alone. The Palmer trial thus helped establish the value of toxicological evidence in court, and in the 1850s, that was a relatively new concept. So as we see, we're already stepping forward into the realm of modern science at this time. Very exciting. In the end, the jury just took over an hour to convict William Palmer of murder. Lord Chief Justice Campbell, in sentencing him, made a point of specifying where the execution would occur. Using a special law to move the execution site, the judge decreed that Palmer would be hanged in Staffordshire, his home county, rather than in London, and they did this explicitly for the sake of setting an example. The idea was to send a grim message to the community that had trusted this doctor. And so, June 14th, 1856, Palmer met his end before a large crowd outside of Stafford Prison. Oh, and by the way, executions were still public at that time. Actually, the last public hanging, in Britain at least, was in 1868. An oft-told anecdote claims that as Palmer stepped onto the gallows and saw the trap door, he asked the hangman, "Are you sure it's safe?" Not joking. Not joking. That's a recorded last words from him. I love that. In any case, I shouldn't be laughing, but yeah. A dark wit to the very end. Well, of course, whether it is apocryphal or not, people do say at the time that he did say that, certainly helped spur that morbid fascination with the man. Certainly gave me a bit of a grin. But the Palmer case offers several insights, you see, mainly into Victorian attitudes and practices. Now, firstly, it unveiled how a serial killer could operate under the radar in a polite society. Multiple family deaths over years raised fewer alarms than they would today. In part, that is precisely because medical certification of death was pretty relaxed, and things like murder was not initially suspected. I mean, people were dropping dead of all sorts of things back then. It wasn't too much of an out-of-the-ordinary thing to have a family member randomly die. But it took the death of a non-relative, that being Cook, and the personal intervention of Cook's stepfather, who refused to let Palmer quickly bury the body, to trigger a proper inquiry. Now, the second thing that we have to say is that Palmer's trial, it showcased the Victorian improvements in policing and forensics, coming around just in time to send him to the rope. Bad timing for him, I suppose. But also showed cooperation between local magistrates, Scotland Yard detectives, and expert chemists, bringing a clever, well-respected, at least once well-respected, killer to justice. Now third, it also fed a widespread Victorian fear of poisoning. Arsenic had long been called the inheritance powder due to its use in getting rid of relatives, and was alarmingly easy to obtain before the 1850s. You could just walk into any old place and buy it. Public anxiety over undetectable poisoners helped drive lethal reforms like the Arsenic Act, of 1851, which required sellers to log buyers' names and to add colouring to arsenic to prevent the more surreptitious use of it. Well, Palmer, however, often used strychnine, a different poison not covered by the 1851 law, exploiting a loophole. His conviction and execution, for example, sent a message that even educated murderers could not escape the noose, and as one Victorian commenter noted, never had a man had a more fair trial or a more deserved fate. Victorian society felt quite a lot helper once the rope had done its work on Dr. Palmer. And of course, with the news of the new forensic technology, it would certainly put any other murderers a little bit on the back foot, that's for sure. All right, and just as it starts pouring down rain outside, we move on to our next unsavory character. Now, if Palmer represents that lone gentleman poisoner, the next case features a conspiracy of women in the slums of Liverpool. That's right, it's not just all about London, and it's a pretty stark contrast in social setting, but chillingly similar in other methods. So we find ourselves in early 1880s. Two Irish immigrant sisters, that being Catherine Flanagan, 55, and Margaret Higgins, 40, ran a lodging house in Liverpool Court off Scotland Road. They were widows of modest means, known to take in boarders. Between 1880 and 83, a series of people connected to their household suddenly died. Catherine's own son, a stepdaughter of Margaret, a young woman lodger, and finally, Thomas Higgins, Margaret's husband. Each death was attributed to illnesses like fever or dysentery at first. Each time, the sisters collected small life insurance or burial society payouts, the Victorian equivalent of insurance fraud by murder, I suppose. In the cramped courts of Liverpool's poorest district, high mortality was, sadly, quite common, and it appears that Flanagan and Higgins cleverly exploited this. They would insure a victim in secret, poison them with arsenic, and then quickly claim the money. Sums in order of £20 to £100 at the time. Pretty modest. But that's all relative, isn't it? It was quite significant to them. Of course, this went on until a pattern emerged too strong to ignore. The downfall of the Black Widows of Liverpool, as the press later dubbed them, came after Thomas Higgins' death in 83. Thomas's brother grew suspicious when he learned that multiple insurance policies had been taken out on Thomas's life with various companies. He also discovered that an insurance doctor had tried to examine Thomas, a requirement for one large policy, only to be rudely turned away by Thomas himself, who knew exactly nothing about the policy and said he didn't need life insurance. Well, these red flags led the brother to alert the authorities. As Thomas Higgins' funeral was literally about to commence, police and the coroner arrived to halt it. They found, disturbingly, that a death-wake party was in full swing, the coffin surrounded by merrymaking rather than mourning, and Catherine Flanagan actually tried to flee out the back door when the officials came in. The body was sent for autopsy, and the results? Decisive. Thomas had died from arsenic poisoning. There was nothing else for it. Investigators then ordered the exhumation of the earlier deceased from the sister's household, the corpses of Catherine's son, Margaret's stepdaughter, and the teenage lodger. They all showed fatal quantities of arsenic too. Furthermore, the search of the premises turned up arsenic-laced fry pans and traces of arsenic in the sister's clothing and belongings. Well, you can't get better evidence than that, can't you? Truly caught red-handed. Now arsenic, as it turns out, was indeed the murder weapon, and the sisters would obtain arsenic by soaking fly papers, which were saturated with arsenic to kill flies. They would do this in water and then administer the arsenic solution to the victims. So they didn't go out and buy the arsenic, because if they did, well, they'd have to put their names down, wouldn't they, as we mentioned. So they had to get it by the roundabout method. Of course, this method was well known in Victorian crime law indeed. Another famous case in 1809, Florence Maybrick, a Liverpool socialite accused of poisoning her husband, involved a similar flypaper trick. Flanagan and Higgins were arrested and charged. Though notably, prosecutors, despite the evidence, chose to charge them with only one murder, that is, the murder of Thomas Higgins. They were doing this to simplify the trial. It was pretty common then to try serial poisoners on a single sample case where evidence was the strongest. The trial at Liverpool St. George's Hall in February of 1884 lasted 3 days and ended with a guilty verdict after just 40 minutes of jury deliberation. And the sisters were sentenced to death. On March 3rd, 1884, they were hanged side by side at Kirkdale Jail in Liverpool, each sister simultaneously dropping to her fate when the trapdoor opened. Snap necks. Doesn't take long. The Liverpool poison conspiracy created quite a sensation, not just locally, but nationally. The notion of working-class women operating a cold-blooded murder ring for a little bit of insurance money, it was pretty shocking. Newspapers called them the Borgia sisters of the slums, invoking Renaissance poisoners and Black Widow stereotypes. It soon emerged that Catherine Flanagan, once caught, attempted to save herself by turning informer. She offered to list additional murders and accomplices in exchange for leniency. And indeed, she provided the names of other women in the community that she claimed were involved in similar insurance poison plots. She named purported fellow poisoners, and even complicit insurance agents who helped arrange the payouts. How deep does it go? However, the authorities were reluctant to credit the words of a convicted murderer seeking a deal. Maybe she thought the more information she gave, that the more lenient they would be. Might just end up with a cozy room or something. Ultimately, no further prosecutions were made. Possibly the police felt they had to just cut off the head of the snake by executing the two sisters, and proving a wider conspiracy. Well, that would be exceedingly difficult, with all the evidence resting on Flanagan's words alone. And this raises quite an interesting question. Were there indeed more burial club killers operating in Victorian City? Well, some have suspected that the Liverpool case was the tip of an iceberg, where unscrupulous individuals, often women, who could more easily buy arsenic without suspicion if they claimed it was for killing rats or flies, exploited that nascent life insurance system among the poor. The insurance companies, offering small payouts for funerals and such, unintentionally created a deadly incentive. It took cases like Flanagan and Higgins to spur greater oversight, and after 1884, coroners and insurers became far more vigilant about multiple policies and repeat deaths in one household, and I'm sure those insurance companies were certainly communicating with each other about anything suspicious. But from an investigative standpoint, the Black Widow's case showed the importance of communication between those agencies. You see, it was the brothers' inquiry across several insurance offices that cracked the pattern, but it also showed advances in forensic toxicology. By the 1880s, chemical tests for arsenic were routine and sensitive. The detection of arsenic in exhumed bodies gave prosecutors ironclad proof, whereas a generation earlier such evidence might have been ambiguous or missed entirely. And finally, this case affected Victorian popular culture. The image of the middle-aged, gin-swilling, money-starved widow with a vial of poison became a bit of a stock villain in a lot of those penny dreadful stories. It also unfortunately fed biases. You see, because Catherine and Margaret were Irish immigrants, some in England used that as an opportunity to, kick them while they were down, I suppose, that community. The Irish were not doing very well at that point. Well, the added prejudice just made things worse. They depicted the women inherently as savage or morally deficient, not on individual grounds, but rather because they were from Ireland. Yet as we've seen, respectable English doctors like Palmer, they were equally capable of serial murder. But those caveats don't really sell newspapers, don't they? Contemporaneous with Palmer, but only brought to justice in the 1870s, another often cited criminal by criminologists is Mary Ann Cotton. They say that she's Britain's first convicted female serial killer. But her case was long less famous than it is perhaps deserved, overshadowed by later killers. But modern scholarship has revived interest in her extraordinary crime spree. You see, Cotton was a coal miner's wife from County Durham, who over a span of roughly 20 years lost an alarming number of family members due to gastric fever. Now, these included 3 husbands, a lover, her own mother, and at least 11 of her children or stepchildren. So in total, it is suspected that she poisoned 21 people with arsenic, mainly for the insurance payouts again, or just to alleviate her financial burdens. Always comes back to the money, doesn't it? Well, in the era before robust public welfare, marrying and then burying husbands was, as twisted as it sounds, a main source of income. She would insure a spouse or child via a so-called burial society, which paid for funeral costs and a small sum to the survivors. And then she would start administering arsenic, collect the money after a doctor wrote the death off as gastric illness. Now remember, doctors, they can only do so much. They were not toxicologists. They were not trained in this. So we can't really put the blame on them. In any case, arsenic poisoning does mimic stomach diseases, symptoms like vomiting, diarrhea, abdominal pain, which made it a favored murder weapon for those with the intent. For many years, Mary Ann Cotton evaded serious suspicion. Victorians had trouble imagining that a mother would systematically kill off her own children. And moreover, 19th century infant mortality was high, and life was precarious in the industrial north. Multiple deaths in one family, while tragic, it didn't immediately scream murder to neighbors or doctors. Cotton was also mobile. She moved around, contracting brief marriages and employment as a nurse or housekeeper, leaving a trail of graves in different towns from Sunderland to West Auckland. This geographic spread made it quite a bit more difficult for any one authority to see the pattern. But ultimately, her downfall in 1872 was precipitated by the death of her stepson, Charles Edward Cotton, and that poor lad was only 7 years old. Marianne had complained frequently that Charles was an inconvenience and stood between her and a new marriage. So when Charles died after a sudden illness, an attentive local surgeon, alarmed by rumors and Marianne's suspicious conduct, obtained samples from the boy's body. An inquest was held, and the surgeon's tests confirmed arsenic in the victim's stomach. Marianne Cotton was arrested, and the exhumation of recent victims provided further damning evidence. Most recent, of course, being her last husband, Frederick Cotton, and 2 of his children. Marianne Cotton's trial in Durham in '73 riveted the public. Here was a working-class 40-year-old woman, outwardly quite ordinary, even unremarkable in looks and manners, accused of being a prolific serial murderer. Her motives appeared to be mercenary. She would rid herself of unwanted mouths to feed or replace one husband with another by deploying poison and, in the process, claim a bit of insurance money. A real system, that's for sure. Now the press, of course, grabbed onto this and sensationalized her as an enchantress or a fiend in female form. Cartoons showed her with a bottle of arsenic or as a skeleton's bride. Yet some observers noted how circumstantial the case was, highlighting the limitations in the day. Indeed, Marianne was tried only for one murder, that being the stepson Charles, even though multiple bodies had arsenic traces. The prosecution, lacking direct proof that she administered the poison, leaned on the alleged pattern and even a little bit of hearsay. One contentious piece of testimony was that Marianne had beaten the young Charles savagely days before his death, a claim not backed by the initial medical exam, but introduced in the court nonetheless. Her defense argued that the boy could have died accidentally from ingesting arsenic from environmental sources. Now, we have to remember that arsenic was in the wallpaper, the paints. They even claimed a cleaning product called soft soap at a time had a fair bit of arsenic in it too. Interestingly, a report in The Lancet, a leading medical journal, had suggested the possibility of accidental arsenic poisoning in this case, but Marianne's defense never brought it up. But you think they would have brought that up, right? But they also suggested that he might have inhaled arsenic from dye in the wallpaper, which was a known hazard back then. Despite these arguments, the jury took only 90 minutes to convict Marianne Cotton. Her calmly stoic demeanor in the dock likely did not win her any sympathy either. The Victorian public expected a wrongly accused woman to break down in tears or fainting. But Marianne just remained composed, which many took as a sign of guilt. A kind of thinking, well, the jig's up now. I am going to be hanged. In any case, she was. March 24th, 1873, at Durham Jail. And the event was reported in quite grim detail, because by then, executions in Britain were conducted behind prison walls. The Capital Punishment Amendment of 1868 had ended public hangings. Only journalists and officials witnessed her death. But still, the descriptions reached the papers. Marianne, it was said, walked to the gallows, ghostly pale but with a firm step, praying audibly. She was attended by clergymen, and reportedly repeated prayers with lips moving as the hangman bound her. At the last moment on the scaffold, as the white cap was pulled over her face and the noose placed around her neck, she scowled fiercely, and with an air of defiance at those present. final flash of temper from a woman who had maintained her innocence. Anyway, the bolt was drawn, and she dropped to her death. As one press account phrased it, quote, "The wretched woman launched into eternity." After a few convulsive movements, her body hung still. Notably, the undersheriff who witnessed the hanging fainted dead away when the drop fell. Well, in the days leading up to her execution, Mary Ann Cotton was pressed repeatedly to confess or repent. Clergymen came to visit her, showing salvation contingent on truth. And according to one reverend's reports, she eventually made a semi-confession, saying, quote, "I believe I have been the agent, but not intentionally." Well, that's a little bit cryptic, isn't it? Well, suggests perhaps she admitted administering something, but claimed it was not meant to kill. Large-ditch attempt to square her conscience, perhaps, but if you make a mistake once, that's fine, but 21 times? Come on. Well, when confronted with the fact that her alleged murders happened over years, with intervals in between, she apparently grew sullen and didn't want to talk anymore. How convenient. Well, she never gave a full confession, though. To the end, she insisted that any poison found in her house must have come from vermin killers or Dyer, not a deliberate crime. The public, however, had very little doubt or sympathy, and she quickly entered folklore. Children in the northeast of England sang a ghoulish skipping rhyme, "Sing, sing, what can I sing? Mary Ann Cotton, tied up with string. She's gone to the graveyard. She's gone." I suppose children back then were of a different breed. Well, the exact lyrics varied, but the gist is pretty clear. She'd become an object of morbid nursery ridicule, a byword for evil. And it's telling that while Mary Ann Cotton killed far more people than Jack the Ripper, her name is far less known today. Victorian society, well, terrified of her, perhaps found it a bit easier to forget her in favor of more sensational and mysterious killers. Only recently has she been the subject of biographies and television dramas, reminding us that serial murder is certainly not a modern invention, nor is it exclusively the domain of men. But there is also quite a bit of critical analysis of the Cotton case, and it shows those contemporary limitations. Policing was highly local. It took place in rural County Durham, far from London's nascent detective force. And there was no central register to notice that Mary Ann had been connected to many deaths in different locales. The medical community was divided. Some doctors were advancing forensic toxicology, but others failed to notice red flags, or were reluctant to accuse a woman. Indeed, one reason Mary Ann got away with so much, was likely that doctors simply wrote gastric fever on death certificates without even testing. It wasn't mandatory to perform chemical tests in every suspicious death. Only persistent suspicion led to the examination of Charles Cotton's remains. And additionally, the case reveals a bit of a cultural bias in action. The jury and public readily painted Mary as a uniquely wicked woman, possibly overlooking the fact that poverty and the lack of divorce options might have tempted her into seeing murder as a way out of desperate situations. That doesn't explain the children, though. Of course, that's not to excuse her. Clearly, many poor women did not resort to killing off their husbands and children to solve their financial problems, but is certainly a nuanced layer of Victorian commentary that's largely ignored. To them it was boiled down to her just being, well, as the papers called her, a devil in petticoats. But as the Victorian era progressed, the metropolis of London in particular grew into a teeming urban world of pretty deep contrasts. affluence and poverty, vice and virtue, everything in between. It is in London of the late 1880s and 90s that we find Dr. Thomas Neill Cream, a figure as sinister as the nickname suggests, a nickname of the Lambeth poisoner, a doctor who used his medical knowledge to prey on vulnerable women in the capital. His case is particularly interesting because it spans multiple countries, and it highlights how early attempts at what we would call criminal profiling unfolded. He was born in Glasgow and raised in Canada. Cream obtained medical training, but developed a proclivity for crime and debauchery. He had already served prison time in Illinois in the USA for poisoning a patient in the early 1880s who many people believed to likely have been his mistress. Just break up with her, mate. You don't have to poison her. Anyway, in 1891, after release, he came to London, settling in the Lambeth area, which at that time was a run-down, dingy old place south of the Thames, rife with night workers. And there, between autumn 1891 and the spring of 1892, women started dying in Lambeth and Southwark districts under mysterious circumstances. Most were women who worked in those nightly professions. Cream encountered them, and the poisons did their work. He would ingratiate himself as a doctor, sometimes offering pills or potions, supposedly for ailments and things like that. Also abortifacients, which in fact contained lethal doses of strychnine. Well, at least 4 women, Ellen Donworth, Matilda Clover, Alice Marsh, and Emma Shrivel, died after crossing paths with Dr. Cream in London. Now, I don't know about you, but Dr. Cream reminds me of Dr. Pepper. It sounds like some kind of drink or something. That's not very historical, but I'm just commenting. Couldn't help myself. Anyway, I'll get back to it. I do apologize. No, because these victims were of a marginalized class, their deaths might not have been connected, if not for Cream's bizarre behavior. He had a habit of attempting to frame others and extort money in the aftermath of the murders. Once again, follow the money. Always comes down to greed. For example, after Matilda Clover's death, Cream wrote letters to a prominent physician in London accusing him of poisoning her and demanding cash to keep quiet. The physician was quite confused. He'd never heard of the woman at all, and thus he turned the letters over to police. Cream did similar things with other cases, writing to authorities or acquaintances of victims to cast suspicion elsewhere, sometimes even naming prominent figures in a possible bid to confuse investigators or simply out of a perverse thrill. I suppose we'll never know. But his strange letter-writing campaign ultimately helped Scotland Yard detect a pattern. Someone was claiming knowledge of multiple women dying from strychnine in Lambeth. By mid-1892, the police focused, narrowed on Dr. Cream. Well, Thomas Neill Cream was then arrested and tried at the Old Bailey in October of 1892. The prosecution painted him as a cold-blooded serial poisoner who used strychnine, a poison causing agonizing convulsions, to kill for gratification and possibly silence potential blackmail victims, as some of the women, by the way, might have been in relationships with him or knew of his quack abortive services. It was noted that he had purchased strychnine in London using his medical credentials, signing the poison register as required by law, just as Mary Ann Britland and others did for such poisons. At trial, expert witnesses described the symptoms of the victims, which matched Strychnine's effects precisely. But perhaps even more damning were Cream's own letters, tying him to details only the poisoner could know. And because of that, the jury did not take long to convict. Thomas Neill Cream was sentenced to hang. November 15th, 1892. Dr. Cream was executed at Newgate Prison. The hanging was private, but a press correspondent from abroad reported in curious detail, quote, Dr. Thomas Neill Cream, the wholesale girl poisoner, was executed on Tuesday morning at Newgate. He died quietly, but said on the gallows that he expected a reprieve, adding that for many years he had been a Sunday school superintendent and a prominent member of the New York YMCA. Well, this statement, an appeal to his past religious credentials, struck observers as either pathetic self-delusion or a final attempt at image management. Well, it was pretty obvious by now that he was certainly not the cream of the crop. Right, so it's as if Cream could not believe that he could truly hang, because he fancied himself too well connected or too important. Perhaps he was trying to cite his religious convictions because he thought God was the only one who would forgive him for what he did. Now there's a thought. In any case, Victorian medical men who examined Cream after his conviction came to a consensus that he was likely of unsound mind, at least in a lay sense, and indeed modern eyes might diagnose Cream as a psychopathic narcissist. He seemed to revel in the power of life and death, and in taunting others about his secret knowledge. So this case intersects with early theories of criminal instability and profiling. The police officials at Scotland Yard, notably Inspector Frederick Smith, began to see that the Lambeth poisonings were the work of one man with a consistent modus operandi, perhaps one of the first glimmers of recognizing a serial killer pattern in real time, aside from the more obvious case of the Whitechapel murders in 1888. But we're not here to talk about them, aren't we? At Cream's trial, his defense did attempt an insanity plea, though not very vigorously. After his execution, there were debates in medical circles about whether he had been insane. As a sign of the times, an autopsy was performed on Cream's body, but the authorities refused to allow an examination of his brain, which could have potentially revealed any anomalies. In other words, they carried out the sentence without indulging scientific curiosity about the mind of a serial murderer, which, well, is a bit of a shame. They should have taken the opportunity. Victorian society's priority was punishing the criminal, not understanding them, a reflection of that era's more moralistic outlook. And here's a macabre postscript for you. There was a legend that arose as the trapdoor opened and the rope tightened around Cream's neck, that he shouted, "I am Jack the," as if to confess about being Jack the Ripper, but was cut off by the noose. Well, it sounds pretty fascinating, I know, but it's almost certainly made up and chronically implausible, since Cream was in prison in 1888 when the Ripper struck, so unless he was finding a way of sneaking out at night, I really doubt that was possible. But it is nonetheless showing because that Victorians love to connect the dots between notorious crimes, as they're making up their own little stories in the pubs and bars, all the rest. In any case, Cream's murders occurred only a few years after the Ripper hysteria, and the public, press, and even some police mulled whether other unsolved killings might be laid at his feet. In truth, Cream was a different kind of killer. Poison, not a knife, that was his weapon. Pretty common for the Victorian MO, I think. and his victims were generally not mutilated or obviously murdered at first glance. But the press did link Cream to a larger phenomena of modern urban serial murder, a very disturbing trend at the time, often bracketed in with Whitechapel's terror. And so the Lambeth poisoner's legacy then is part of the learning curve for police. By the 1890s, London detectives had gained hard experience in recognizing when a series of murders indicated a single perpetrator at work. And in Cream's case, unlike the Rippers, they caught and convicted the culprit, thanks to a blend of gumshoe work, that is tracking purchasers of poison, interviewing witnesses in the Lambeth underworld, and of course, the forensic proof, at least within the science at the time. Well, thus far, our killers have mainly targeted adults, friends, spouses, paid trysts. But now we turn to a particular unsettling category of Victorian serial murderer, infanticide for profit, perpetuated by so-called baby farmers. This is an even darker section of the video. Well, chief among these was Amelia Dyer, a name that sent shivers down the spines of Victorians of the 1890s. Dyer's crimes hold a mirror to Victorian social hypocrisy and the desperate plight of unmarried mothers. The practice of baby farming arose in the era's harsh attitudes. An unmarried woman who bore a child had very few options. Philanthropic adoption was rare, and keeping an illegitimate baby often meant social ruin and destitution. Enter the baby farmer. Individuals, usually women, who, for a fee, would take in infants either temporarily or permanently, to foster them or find them homes. Now, in principle, it sounds pretty benevolent, but in practice, it was ripe for abuse. Many baby farmers simply neglected the infants, letting them pass of malnutrition. Angel making, it was called euphemistically, which is pretty terrible. Well, a few, like Amelia Dyer, took a more direct and ghastly route to dispose of the children swiftly. Amelia Dyer was a trained nurse and midwife, born in 1837, who turned to baby farming in the 1870s. For decades, she operated under the radar, moving from town to town, Bristol, London, Reading, often changing her surname to avoid detection. She had quite the string of aliases. Initially, she might have started by passive neglect, but eventually Dyer began murdering infants outright soon after taking custody of them. By the 1890s, she had refined the method. She would advertise in the newspapers using respectable false credentials. For example, a notice might read that a married couple in the country sought to adopt a healthy child, terms negotiable. Desperate mothers answered these ads, paid Amelia Dyer a lump sum, perhaps £5 or £10, a significant amount for a poor woman, but pretty cheap compared to raising a child, and entrusted their infants over to her. Dyer would take the children, and within a matter of days or weeks, they would be gone. She would dispose of them. Her favorite MO was strangulation with white tape. Chillingly, when she was later caught, Dyer herself said to police, quote, "You'll know all of mine by the tape around their necks." What a psycho. Proper psycho. Well, indeed, investigators found that in several cases, a length of narrow tape or braid was tied twice around the neck of the tiny victim. Dyer's grim signature. The case broke open in 1896. By then, suspicious infant deaths and disappearances had been circulating in local gossip and press reports in central England. The pivotal moment came in late March 1896, when a bargeman on the River Thames near Reading fished out a carpet bag that emitted a foul odor. And inside was the body of an infant around 6 to 12 months old, later identified as Helena Fry. Around the child's neck was the telltale white tape. Crucially, the bag's lining or the paperwork included a readable name and address, that of Mrs. Thomas, one of Dyer's aliases in Reading. This tangible clue set the police on Dyer's trail. Reading Borough Police, with assistance from the Thames Valley Detective Division, executed a brilliant undercover operation. An inspector posed as a client, contacting Dyer for adoption services, while others quietly gathered evidence. When they raided Dyer's house in April of 1896, they encountered a scene of disturbing evidence. Stacks of baby clothes, pawn tickets for the children's garments suggesting she pawned the infant's clothes after disposing of them, letters from anxious mothers asking about their children, and the pervasive, unmistakable stench of death. Nobodies were in the home, but clearly a hefty trade in infant life had been underway. The Thames was dragged extensively in the following days. In total, corpses of at least 6 infants were recovered from the river, all within a few miles, bearing evidence linking to Dyer, such as that same tape or parcels addressed to her. Investigators suspected that over the previous decades, Amelia Dyer might have killed upwards of 50, perhaps even hundreds, a truly staggering toll. Some later estimates, likely exaggerated, put the number at 300 or more, rivaling the worst modern killers in sheer numbers. And so Amelia Dyer was tried at the Old Bailey, May 1896. But like others before, she was only charged with one count of murder, that of baby Helena Fry, whose body had led to a breakthrough. The evidence, however, brought in other cases to establish pattern and intent. The prosecution had very little trouble convincing the jury. Here was a woman who had profited from taking children under the pretense of adoption, knowing full well she intended to destroy them. Dyer pleaded insanity, and indeed she had a history of brief stints in asylums, but simply she faked mental breakdowns in the past when suspicions rose to avoid scrutiny or give herself a bit of a alibi. But as for the jury, well, they were unconvinced. After barely 5 minutes, and I'm not joking, 5 actual minutes of deliberation, they had well and truly came to a guilty verdict. The judge donned the black cap, and they sentenced Dyers to death. June 10th, 1896. Amelia Dyer, at 58 years old, was hanged at Newgate Prison. She thus became the oldest woman executed in Britain in the 19th century. Fittingly for such a heinous criminal, no mercy was given. The official prison commission log of her hanging noted in dry bureaucratic fashion, quote, "On account of her weight and the softness of the tissues, rather a short drop was given. It proved to be quite sufficient." In other words, because Dyer was heavy set, the executioner calculated a shorter drop to avoid decapitation. The result was still effective and a presumably instantaneous death. The sterile report belies the emotional impact of Dyer's case. Public anger was immense. Unlike victims of other killers or domestic poisoners, Dyer's victims were blameless, voiceless infants, a fact that struck at Victorian moral sensibilities. While crowds outside Newgate sang hymns for the little angels lost and cursed Amelia Dyer's name. Yet paradoxically, it was society's very structures, the shame around illegitimate children, lack of support for single mothers, that created a niche for someone like Dyer to operate. The case prompted widespread calls for reform, and within a year, Parliament strengthened laws on infant adoption and required local authorities to better supervise baby farms. It was too late for perhaps hundreds of innocents. But Victorian Britain did learn from the tragedy, albeit quite slowly. And so how do we reflect on crimes like this? I suppose we can see how a serial killer can also be a symptom of a societal failure. Dyer might be dismissed as simply an ogress, and indeed the press called her the ogress of Reading. But why was she able to kill undetected for so long? One reason is that Victorian society marginalized certain populations. In this case, unwed mothers and their illegitimate children. Out of sight, out of mind, as always. Dyer thrived in that darkness. It took modern investigative techniques, a sting operation effectively coordinated by detective work across counties, use of new forensic photography and record keeping. Police preserved and catalogued the evidence from her home meticulously. All of this was needed to bring her down. The detectives in Reading showed admirable skill, even trailing Dyer for days to see if she would lead them to more evidence, and interviewing dozens of known baby farmers to gather intelligence. The case was a forensic triumph as well. They traced the parcels via microscopic analysis of wrapping paper and handwriting, and a surgeon testified to the cause of death for the infants even after river decomposition. One extraordinary note: some of Amelia Dyer's letters and personal items survived today in the police archives, including that lock of hair mentioned in her reports. These relics are studied by criminologists, and it makes Dyer an early subject of what we'd now call criminal profiling, trying to discern the psychology of a person who could commit serial infanticide. But at the time, Victorian courts didn't deeply probe her psyche. She was simply evil beyond belief. Now, insanity pleas aside, Victorians largely framed serial killers like Dyer as moral monsters rather than victims of mental illness. You can hardly blame them for that, I suppose. And that meant swift executions, arguably a missed opportunity for the early study of serial offender behavior. It would not be until the 20th century that criminologists revisited such cases to ask why it happened. Now, it is worth noting that baby farming murders were not confined to Britain. The British Empire saw similar cases, a reflection of the social conditions and temptations being exportable. For instance, Minnie Dean in New Zealand was convicted and hanged in 1895 for baby farm infanticides, and she remains the only woman ever to be executed in New Zealand. Bit of trivia for you there. Like Dyer, Dean had multiple baby deaths connected to her, and used stratagems to conceal bodies. One legend says she even hid infants in hat boxes when traveling by train. News of Dean's crimes traveled back to England, reinforcing the call for imperial-wide solutions to protect children. Victorian London itself had earlier cases, like Margaret Waters, executed in 1870 for killing infants by neglect, a case that first alerted the public to the baby farming horrors. But Amelia Dyer, well, she was the crescendo, the most prolific and flagrant offender, and it forced Victorian society to confront the ugliness right under their noses. So what did you think about all the murderers? Pretty horrible, isn't it? Suddenly have to tell these stories. And, the Victorian era is it's home to a lot of things like this. Definitely a very strange transition period between the old world and the new world. Industrial revolution, all that sort of thing. Yes. Anyway, I'm going to thank the top tier patrons and supporters: Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Carrie, Charlene, Lynn, Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfred, Nia, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuro Nerd, Erin, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Orthodox Review, Scott, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stephen, Kevin, HMSHH, Crystal, Talbury, Anthony, Lucy, Brandon, Gugu Bubonic, Nicholas, Craig, Neftis, Alexander, Gokhan, Dorsey, Venita, Claire, Courtesy, Carol, Robert, Mary, Bridget, Nefertari, Yvette, Miss Mochi, 11, Allison, Free American, Jennifer, Brittany, David, Cody, Brian, and Are You My Mom? That's the person's name on YouTube. I'm not asking you the question. Okay, everyone. Well, after an hour of this murderous talk together, I think we can walk away with this and think we're very happy to have a modern criminology. Our courts in these days are not perfect. Well, let's say they're imperfect at the best of times and absolutely damned useless at the worst of times. And the worst of times is, unfortunately, most of the time they're operating at their worst. Maybe my country has different problems to yours. Who knows? Anyway, everyone, that's it for me. So I'm going to cook myself dinner. I'm probably going to play a bit of Skyrim. And in the background, I'm going to put on some Dragon Ball and just relax all night. I hope you have a relaxing night planned. Yeah, because that's mine. Good night, everyone. Lots of love to you all. Thank you for joining me, and I will see you when you feel like returning. Farewell for now.